Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Sustainable Futures Seminar Series. You join us on a particularly grey day in Manchester, but fear not, we have two phenomenal sustainability brains today who no doubt will brighten up your, what day are we, Thursday, with some great ideas. And perhaps poignantly in a milestone week as negotiations in Egypt around COP27 come to a conclusion, and also the very same week that the 8 billion baby has been born onto our planet. My name is Jen O'Brien. I am the academic lead for sustainability teaching and learning for the university. I also work with Sustainable Futures in terms of our inspired and informed strategy, which is all about sustainability education. And it's my honour today to welcome two key speakers. They're going to share their thoughts with you for about 15 minutes or so, and then we will open the floor for questions. So please feel free to pop your questions into the chat as our speakers are talking, and then we will pause after each presentation and I will share those with our speakers. Okay, so without further ado, mindful of the time, may I introduce you to Professor Jonatan Pinkse, who is a Professor of Strategy, Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the Alliance Manchester Business School here at the University of Manchester. And Jonatan is going to share with you his thoughts around business models for sustainable energy. Okay.
There we go. I first shared it and then I couldn't find the unmute button anymore. It's always how it goes. Thank you, Jen, and welcome all. Thank you for having me for this talk. I come straight out of the rain, so I know indeed it's miserable. So when I look a bit wet, that's because I am wet. So this is a story about business models for sustainable energy. It's based on research we did over the past few years. It is a recently published paper, although when I first accepted to talk here, it was not yet published, but in the meantime, we've been lucky. So it is mostly information to see what we're doing in the business school in the field of sustainable energy. Because I work in a business school, we try to understand the business behind such technological changes. And what we're particularly interested in is the following. As you probably all know, you'll see that solar energy, wind energy, it's all really rising really fast. So a recent review by Amber, European Electricity, is really showing that 10% of global electricity is now by wind and solar. So that is all very good news, because for a long time we were hoping for this and it wasn't necessarily really happening maybe at the pace that we wanted to. But really since, over the last decade, basically, we've seen a tremendous growth. But that does lead to a question for us. Okay, but what does it do actually to the companies that used to supply electricity to us, the electric utilities? Are they indeed the ones that are really embracing this? Are they really seeing this as a new way of doing business? Because that's what a business model does. A business model explains how you create and capture value. So how is that happening then? Are they really changing what they're doing, what their business is? And here we can be maybe a little bit skeptical, because only 2 years ago, this study came out in Nature Energy that showed an analysis of global utilities and said that only 1 in 10 of these utilities were really prioritizing renewable electricity. Basically, the large part of the activities of the main utilities all around the world was still the good old fossil fuels. So we were interested to see, okay, how does that then work for Europe? Because this was a global analysis, and for Europe, it might be that we are a bit ahead of the rest of the world. So this is what we tried to study. So how did we do that? So basically, we focused on the existing utilities, incumbents, because they are still there. Of course, you have startups, and we've also done studies on the startups, but we're really interested here in what are the main players doing? Are they changing their business model? Would they? Why would they? Because they have a lot of so-called lock-ins, technological, operational, strategically. They have been doing their business in the same kind of way for decades, if not for 100 years. And they don't necessarily have a very high incentive to change that, because in the end, they make money by generating, distributing and selling energy at then the lowest cost possible. And as you now know, that's not very low at all. So they have so-called path dependencies. They tend to do what they used to do, and they might change only incrementally. But when we talk about the climate emergency, we need them to change much faster. Is that really happening? This is what we wanted to study. They, of course, face a lot of pressure that they have to change what they're doing and that they really have to take on board this whole low carbon economy. And there are signs that they're doing that. But to what extent is this really happening? So we really wanted to know how they are changing their business models. We call that business model adaptation. We wouldn't go as far as calling it business model innovation, that they completely change revolutionary ways how they make money. But how do they slowly try to integrate things like solar PV and smart grids, data-driven customer engagement, smart meters, and so forth? What does that do to their business model? So we have two questions. The first one is, how have utilities changed their business model to adapt to the emergence of sustainable energy innovation? And then, which value creation drivers do utilities draw on when adapting their business models? And I'll explain in a minute what value creation drivers are. So how do we look at business models? Because it's a term that is being used in all kinds of different ways, and we followed one specific type of way of looking at it developed by Zot and Ahmed in several papers, one of them published in 2010. And they see a business model quite simply as a range of activities associated with a firm, including those beyond the boundary of the firm, conducted by partners, customers, and vendors. So they see it as some kind of network of different activities. Sometimes the firm might really do it just themselves. Sometimes they might outsource it more and do it more at arm's length in different contractual relationships, but they provide some kind of service or product, in this case, electricity. So looking at it as an activity system, then there are several elements to this activity system. First, there's the content of the activities. What are they actually doing? Then there's the structure. How is this being structured? How does it link together, the different kind of activities that they're doing? And then finally, the governance. How do they actually govern this? What kind of strategic mechanisms are they using? Do they try to acquire others, or they do it more in the form of alliances and so forth? Then we looked at 4 different ways of how it might affect their value creation and capture. So basically how they make money. Is it because they start integrating things that are novel? So they start doing new types of activities or they develop new kinds of structures. Is it that they really try to further strengthen their lock-in? They have a vast customer base and they try to keep their customers. So are they maybe adding new activities to our activity system just to keep their customers with them and not that they would go to startups? Then there's complementarity. How do you try to maybe combine different activities together in novel ways? And then there's efficiency, that you really try to just change your activity system in ways that you further improve your efficiency. You're lowering your transaction costs. Traditionally, utilities really focus on efficiency and lock-in. They try to do things as cheap as possible, and they try to keep their customers captive. It's quite difficult to change your contract. And this is the whole point of how they make money. They try to keep who they have. So what did we do? We tried to focus on so-called boundary spanning transactions. We knew from studying this industry for quite some time that most of the utilities change their business model by starting to acquire or merge or starting joint ventures with other companies. So if they say we need to go more for storage, they're going to go on the lookout for a company that is doing storage and they might buy it. So we try to capture those kind of transactions because that was in a database in the SDC Platinum, and we looked at the transactions of the 20 large incumbents in the European Union over a 30-year period, and to really see what kind of things did they acquire, what kind of joint ventures did they start, and so forth. And these are the different companies. So going straight to the findings, because I only have a few minutes. Not surprisingly, when you look at the content, most of these activities are in renewable electricity generation. Basically what they do, they buy solar and wind, mostly wind. But 18% of the transactions was also in so-called smart electricity management. Everything around smart meters, demand side management, smart grids, and so forth. This is basically the digitalization of the grids. And this also indicates that they're moving towards services, because a lot of this is about improving energy efficiency of their customers. So they're no longer just trying to sell as much energy as possible. No, they're now offering their customers services so their customers can actually be more efficient with their energy use. Something that, of course, should become way more important now. Then there are emerging technologies. These are new things, which was mostly in this period, storage and hydrogen and more general R&D. That's only 5% of the transactions. And then, which was really new over the last 30 years, was sustainable mobility. These companies started investing in electric vehicle recharging infrastructures. But because this only showed up at the last part of the period that we studied, this is only a very small proportion, but this will grow fast. Because this is how it looks like. If you look at over time, the different kind of transactions that they did, a lot of them are wind, much fewer in solar, but still quite a lot over time. And then multi-renewables, that's a combination of solar and wind often. So they would acquire companies that were doing both. Energy efficiency really was a strong one quite in the 1990s. Then it was a bit more lingering. And research and development was really a long time ago, because really at the time they really were focusing more on hydrogen and other kinds of R&D, but it really died down here. Partly because they started doing it also internally, but that is something we don't capture in our data. In terms of sustainable mobility, that really is only in the last part from 2017 to 2019. So looking at the structure, how do they sequence over time and link different activities? Here we looked at within theme, these 4 themes, the structure, as well as between themes. Within the themes, wind, energy efficiency, and R&D are usually the first activities utilities select when pursuing sustainable energy. So really within the renewables, it's all about wind at first. Later on came solar. When it's about smart, it was actually just energy efficiency services and so forth. More interesting is the between theme activity structure. So what kind of themes did they combine and how was that sequenced over time? And here, not surprisingly, the combination of renewable electricity generation and smart electricity management was dominant. Basically, the moment you start investing in renewables, you're investing in intermittent source of electricity. It is on and off depending on the wind or on the sun. So here you need a smarter grid. You need to be able to manage that. So digitalization can really help managing this so you don't have peaks all the time. Then the other one we saw coming up over time was where all 4 themes were combined. But that really only came later, as this one shows. So the dominant one really is the bottom one, the combination of renewable energy and smart. Then the one that really popped up later on was when they started adding sustainable mobility, because it makes a lot of sense. If you're really running your grid and you're making your grid smarter, you're digitalizing everything you do there, that makes these firms way more ready for offering services for electric vehicle owners. So this is how they've been changing. Only reading the last period, we see that they're really almost all go into the broader direction of offering it all. So they're changing quite a lot. Does that have consequences for their business model? Yes, because it means that they're changing from making a product and selling it to really offering a wide variety of different services. And they can do that because they have this large customer base. So you probably will all have been approached by your existing electricity provider to think about, maybe, do you want to put solar panels on your roof? That is their way of trying to keep you with them, because if you go for someone else, they might lose you. So this is how they try to combine it. Finally, the governance. How do actually these utilities manage to do this? How do they expand? How do they adapt? Really, by far, the most dominant form is mergers and acquisitions, where it's mostly an acquisition. Basically, they want to go into a new activity. They have a look around, see a company that does what they want to do, and they buy them. They can now do that because of the whole privatization and the deregulation of the sector, because of the whole EU changes in the EU over the past 2 decades. Joint ventures were still there, but only 8%, and strategic alliances were there as well, about 10%. But interestingly, when you look at mobility, there it wasn't mergers and acquisitions. That was in this period quite new. And there you could see that these companies were using more strategic alliances. Why would they do that? It's a classic story of transaction cost economics. Basically, they see these as more risky. And when you do something that's more risky, you try to not immediately fully own it. You first try to share the burden, the risk with someone else. So you do it as an alliance or a joint venture. But overall, you see that utilities try to change their business model by acquiring stuff. They want to be in control. They want to do it their way. Which leads me to my final observations. If you look at it over time, we can argue, yes, there are huge changes here. Really, but they really try to change their business model by reinforcing their traditional business logic, which is a centralized way of generating electricity and sell it to mainstream customers at the lowest possible price. And that really is everything they keep on doing here as well. There is novelty because the moment you go for solar panels, then you go more for a service. But still, when you look at how they now start integrating solar, a lot of them actually invest in solar farms. So it's much closer to the centralized way of doing business. Still, novelty and complementarity play a bigger role than they used to. They really are trying new things and they really try to combine these different activities. But it's not the case as if these become now super innovative firms that completely change what they've been doing, that everything's upside down. Still, efficiency and lock-in are very important. But it's good to see that at least they are changing and that they try to find new complementarities. And we expect different kind of profiles of these utilities over time. Some might really stress more the services they do for energy efficiency or electric vehicles. Others might really focus a lot more on the type of generation activities they have with solar and so forth. We did another study with some other colleagues where we really tried to see, are there also more novel business models that are out there and that they're doing, like peer-to-peer business models, cooperatives. And we did see that over time, larger utilities were starting to buy startups that would do such more innovative business models. These all started as startups, but then they became the target of acquisitions. But that's a different study. So that's the story here. And I'm looking forward to some questions.
Thank you, Jonatan, ever so much. What an interesting talk. Thank you. Can we welcome questions, please, into the chat function, which you should all have access to? Feel free if you have any observations or any questions. We put our speakers under a very narrow time frame of 15 minutes. So any areas that you would like Jonatan to develop or to flesh out in greater detail, please do feel free to put your thoughts into the chat. And as that is happening, maybe as I can use chair's prerogative, if you like, Jonatan, to ask the first question. And it struck me, forgive me, this is not at all my area of expertise, but if I understand it correctly, your study focused particularly on the mergers and the acquisitions and strategic alliances and the joint ventures that then trace the business model adaptation. Could you tell me a little bit, please, about the extent to which utilities are also thinking about their in-house sustainability energy activities? Who are they as well?
Well, that's definitely something that is changing as well. We can't capture that with this data. This database is really just showing transactions of what they do with others outside. If you look at it more traditionally as studies looking at, okay, how innovative, how much R&D are utilities doing? Historically, that is quite disappointing. They basically tend to rely on companies like General Electric and Siemens to do the innovation for them. But that's changing now because they see that for these new technologies, they need to have a much stronger strategic hold over it. So they are starting to do a lot more R&D in-house, and they're further developing that as well. So we did check, for example, what they claim in their on their websites and in their annual reports. And there you really see a change over time in how they talk about what they're doing and how they're further developing that. And if you look at, for example, a company that is not yet part of our sample here, but that's a very interesting one in the UK that has become one of the biggest fast, is Octopus Energy. And there you see that combination, because they've been growing very fast by really leveraging digital technologies and so forth, but also by acquiring. So they, for example, just acquired my supplier, Bulb. Might be some other customers here. So we're waiting for that to be finalized because it's still a bit in the middle. So there you see also that combination. But they really realize now we cannot just rely on what others are doing for us. If we want to play this game, we need to have a lot more control over what we're doing. And this is why they really, when they acquire, they also want to have full ownership over it.
Thank you. Thank you. I think many of us know Octopus quite well at the moment. Some questions are coming through the chat. Big one, straight in there from Patrick Hackett, asking whether you see petrochemical companies devaluing fossil assets anytime soon.
Not from this study, because this is not about petrochemical companies. This is about electric utilities. I don't know. I've not studied that, but if I currently look at what they're doing, I'm not seeing this. And that's, of course, partly because of the energy crisis we have now. There are two options. Either we do a recarbonization, we really invest big time in fossil fuels again, or we go for decarbonization. They play the game of saying we are doing both. If you probably will look at the transactions, my gut feeling is that they will by far invest most in fossil fuels still. That's exactly the same thing we found with these electric utilities. I've only showed the patterns here of their transactions related to sustainable energy. The whole data set is also what they do in non-sustainable energy. That was the vast majority of transactions. So also these companies, this is what they focus on still mostly. It's changing, but by far not as fast as we were hoping for. And that was the other study in Nature Energy that I mentioned as well, showing like, ooh, this is actually not going that fast.
Thank you. And I think we've got time, a couple of minutes just for the last question that's coming from Tim Bronholtz-Spate, who's asking, do you know what kinds of bundles of services utilities are now offering? And is there any analysis of that?
We've been looking into that, not yet fully for this, but more anecdotally, because the data that we had here focuses on the transactions, but every deal has a deal text. So it explains what they're actually doing and why they're doing that and so forth. And by going through that, we did that to code them to know if they're actually fitting in our sample, yes or no. And that can really be all kinds of different services. It depends a little bit what they focus on. So demand side management is now becoming more important, but really for industrial customers. So if you want to do peak shaving and say, okay, hey, can you switch on or switch off your appliances? They don't yet do that for the individual customer, but they are trying to do that for industrial customers because that makes much more of a difference. I don't know what else they're currently doing by a detailed thing, but you see on all their websites now that for almost all the big utilities, they allow you to buy solar panels. They will try to roll out smart meters and so forth. You probably also have all had the disappointments by being a customer in that way, that what they do is not necessarily very sophisticated. I had a very uninterested bulb engineer come to me, put it in-house, and then half of it wasn't working and they couldn't be bothered. So from anecdotal evidence, are they really fully embracing it? Well, a lot more on their website than in reality. So I wouldn't say that these firms have now become beautiful service-oriented companies with very innovative business models. It's just not really how they run because they don't really have to. You're going to still buy electricity, You're not going anywhere. And the number of alternatives you had has been diminished because many of the startups went bankrupt over the past 2 years.
Thank you, Jonatan, ever so much. I'm mindful of time. We have 1 minute for a final question, if there's any more from the floor. Oh, it's appreciation from Tim there in response to your answer. Thank you. Okay, well, if there's no more questions from the floor, thank you ever so much, Jonatan, for an amazing presentation. Some fantastic questions. I think we've answered all the ones that have come through in the chat. Let me just double check. Yes, we have indeed. So thank you ever so much. And it's my great pleasure now to welcome Jo, who is our second presenter for the day. We've just got a minute or two, Jo, for you to load your slides up as we are perfectly on time. So Dr. Jo Blakey is a lecturer in human geography within the School of Environment, Education and Development at the University of Manchester, and is going to talk to us today about the dangers and distractions of net zero carbon. So similar to our first presentation, please feel free to put questions into the chat while Jo is talking, and we will have time after the presentation to answer them. Thank you, Jo, ever so much.
Thanks, Jen. I appreciate that. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming along. So I want to talk with you today about some of my work on zero carbon. I want to talk about the concept, how it can take on many different meanings, and think about how in turn this can distract us from a more meaningful politics about how we might make the rapid reductions required to remain within safer levels of warming. I then want to make some suggestions for, exactly that, how we might have a more robust political debate around what we are to do. So, and get my slides to work, there we go. Who am I? Well, I'm a lecturer in human geography, as Jen mentioned, and broadly speaking, I'm a political geographer with environmental interests. And I tend to focus on the role of experts in shaping political and social change. The work that I'm talking with you about today is based on, again, some of my work around carbon accounting and urban carbon accountability, and it's seeded in a 5-year autoethnographic study of working as a carbon accountant in Manchester and alongside some others doing the same. So I think it's fair to say there's now a rough consensus on net zero carbon being a good and a desirable thing. I mean, there's obviously some exceptions, but it's adopted widely as a policy goal by virtually all political persuasions. So from the most environmentally conscious socialist to the more stringently neoliberal conservative. What I note, though, is that they nonetheless talk about that future and the journey to that future in radically different ways. So we've broad agreement on net zero carbon, but I think critical questions on what it means and requires can often get overlooked. And so in this presentation, I'm concerned with the following question. What does talking about net zero carbon in very general terms do to the political possibilities for pro-environmental action? So before I start, I want to mention why I'm putting that net in brackets. And that's to do with the differences amongst targets that different territories and entities are setting. So for clarity, zero carbon refers to reducing emissions to absolute zero or to near enough there. Net zero carbon or carbon neutral, meanwhile, imply that some balancing has happened. So by offsetting or removing emissions. And I want to get into some of the problems of that a little later on. Again, I think it's problematic that they're also conflated in the public and arguably even political consciousness. So when I'm using net in brackets, I'm using it today to capture all of these different terms. Now, I also think when we're doing these kind of interdisciplinary talks, I don't think we tend to talk about our theoretical backgrounds often enough, but I think in this instance it's useful as it explains why I'm thinking about zero in the way that I am. So for those of you that are interested, I contribute to a small body of literature called post-foundational geography. And this incorporates a group of political philosophers who suggest that there's no perfect way to make sense of the world or order society, and that however much we might try, there's always something that ends up being excluded. And it's in working with and through these ideas that I've started to think about zero and thinking through what zero itself excludes or overlooks. So based on my work and these theories, I want to pose 4 often excluded or overlooked questions that I think we should be asking in relation to net zero carbon. First, carbon is emitted at various points within the production, transportation, consumption, and disposal of goods. And establishing responsibility for these emissions depends on your standpoint. Is it the consumer, the manufacturer, the haulage firm, the investor, the source country, or the destination country who really should be accountable for them? So I think the point here is that our actions and impacts do not respect spatial and political boundaries. I therefore think we need to ask how zero carbon imagines carbon accountability over space. Is it just looking within boundary, or at energy, or at emissions from consumption or investment? I think these are all vital levers that any one nation, city, business, or individual could pull to help the planet as a whole get to zero. But I think too often we're talking in narrow terms when we're mentioning zero carbon without really defining our parameters. So for instance, if we think about the carbon credentials of the city's airport, which has been branded as carbon neutral. Carbon neutral here refers to the emissions from heating and operating its buildings, so not to do with the flights that leave or the emissions from its consumption or waste. To the everyday reader, though, I think it's fair to say that they're not likely to overly question this, and that this can maybe too often be taken at face value. And similarly for cities, what we measure tends to be what we manage. And studies have shown that zero carbon plans typically focus on things like green energy over and above things like decarbonising consumption, investment, or travel beyond the city's boundary. And again, these are really, really important because these are other levers that we can and arguably should be pulling. So I think it's critical to ask what's included and excluded in your definition of zero, and ask if it's possible to include more of these other important things. Second, much has been made of the race to zero and zero carbon target dates, but having a sooner target date does not necessarily mean you're doing more to achieve safer levels of warming. Manchester, for instance, could emit more between now and 2035 than it could by now and 2038. The end year is important, but it's not the most important factor. The thing that matters is what happens in the meantime. I also think the glossy tagline also risks us being distracted from action today. So instead, we should be thinking about the total amount of emissions that will gather in the atmosphere by the net zero carbon end date. In other words, cumulative emissions. And I know this is something that my colleagues at the Tyndall Centre have been really good at highlighting. So I think setting a budget and a pathway for how much we can emit overall and sticking to them is really what matters most. So we should ask more about the journey that's being imagined or suggested by current levels of action or inaction. Third, and as I hinted at before, there are huge issues with the idea that we can somehow balance our high levels of emissions. And what I'm about to say is based on something that I wrote in a Policy at Manchester publication on net zero a couple of years ago, alongside John Broderick and Matt Patterson. So many targets are dependent on offsetting schemes that do things like distributing more efficient cook stoves to prevent emissions that would have otherwise happened, or to remove carbon from the sky by doing things like tree planting. So for all offset projects, there are significant concerns about whether the carbon ever re-enters the atmosphere, such as if a tree was burned down, for instance, about whether the project will proceed anyway in the absence of the offset, and whether or not the emissions or balanced emissions are being calculated in their entirety. Meanwhile, negative emissions technologies like capturing carbon mechanically and injecting it deep underground do a better job at getting around these issues, but it's pricey and the scale at which they can be deployed is highly uncertain. So we always need to ask what hope is being placed upon balancing emissions in the future to achieve zero. Encouraging a movement towards absolute zero and away from balancing gives us a much better chance. Fourth and finally, we ought to look back at what we've done in the past and not just to the future. So when we're imagining what leeway to allow ourselves in the future, we ought to take stock of how many of us have inherited the wealth and way of living facilitated by a high carbon past. I think we need more humility from former high emitters in terms of the emission spaces that they're occupying or demanding for the future, to explore how this figures in visions for net zero carbon, and to explore how some form of accommodation or reparation could be offered if it doesn't. So, imposing these 4 frequent oversights, what do I suggest we do to bring these questions firmly back into our sights? Well, I mentioned the theories I work with earlier, and a group of scholars here have suggested that our consensus around expert knowledge means that critical political questions do not get asked. And I think this is kind of what has played out. As I mentioned at the start, almost everyone is seemingly in agreement about net zero being necessary, but they imagine it meaning different things, and these point to more or less environmentally stable futures. It's debating the virtues of these multiple meanings that I think gets lost because we focus so much on the tagline and how we all agree on it. So please don't interpret this as a doubting of the science. There's a genuine fear of misinformation and post-truth that I think we should be really careful around. Rather, it's to say that the key soundbite that's emerged from the science, net zero carbon, has been able to become a vague term to have real political teeth. And we need to signal where there is genuine debate required, where more could be done, and where there are some slightly spurious claims entering the mix. So based on what I've said, here's what I think we should do. I think we should focus our efforts on interrogating how entities or territories are imagining the journey to net zero carbon rather than just the destination. And relatedly, we should focus on budgets, cumulative emissions, and making rapid year-on-year reductions, rather than just imagining a waypoint in the future where we go zero carbon. We need to ask what, if anything, is being done to take accountability for historical emissions and to challenge anyone who is taking a larger share of the pie. I think we need to be skeptical of assumptions around emissions offsetting or removals and to not leave this risk-taking unchallenged. I think we need to be more specific and probing as to what net zero carbon refers to and what's not covered. It therefore makes sense to me to talk about things like zero carbon energy and zero carbon supply chains, rather than seemingly catch-all terms like net zero carbon cities that, maybe don't always define their parameters. So for experts operating in policy circles, I think the best thing we could do here is to show multiple stances of the stakes and to clearly highlight what we are and are not talking about. I think we can do this by highlighting our assumptions, our parameters, and the other ways we could make sense of our footprints or carbon accountabilities more actively. And that is everything from me. It's been wonderful speaking with you all. I hope it's of interest, and if you've got questions, I'm happy to discuss. These are the references I've mentioned, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, ever so much. Perfectly timed. Everyone has just been so amazingly to time today, which is also much appreciated. Thank you. Gosh, so much to consider. Please do, folks, feel free to pop your questions into the chat box, which I can then relay to Joe if there's anything that you'd like him to elaborate on or go into greater detail. Lots of food for thought, I do appreciate. I guess just while questions are coming in, Joe, can I ask you just to say a little bit more? You opened up your presentation saying that this was based upon 5 years of autoethnographic work in Manchester City Council. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is based on work that I started in my PhD, where I did an autoethnography of working with it was the CO2 monitoring group at the time, which was advised the Manchester Climate Change Agency. And help them with the reporting, and it's now the Manchester Zero Carbon Advisory Group.
Okay, thank you. And I guess sort of from one geographer to another, and you did use the word a couple of times, can I ask a little bit about the role of scale and the role that scale plays in all of this? So if your analysis today is based upon an autoethnography of municipal levels, Would your argument be any different if we were talking about a planetary scale or a national scale or a local scale? Does this argument hold across all of those different levels?
Thanks, Jen. I think it does hold, but I think I find the city level really, really interesting, because I tend to find with these things, the more local you go, the more slippery the concept gets. I mean, the thing about cities, and I remember, you know, one of the first people that I ever spoke with when I was doing my PhD work, they said, the issue is with cities is that people move around more. People leave cities more often than they leave their country. And that movement in and out of the city border, I think, creates complexities for how we're thinking about net zero. So, you know, it always shocks me, you know, thinking that we don't account for rail journeys out of the city, or driving out of the city, or maybe the whole commute of people coming into or going home from the city, or maybe the food chains that feed our cities, right? And again, as a geographer, I think we've become very good about thinking about flows and the things that sustain our cities. So when I first, you know, became aware of this, I was kind of quite shocked about that. So I think the city level is the area where we can almost be most critical in a way. But yeah, I definitely think it does work. You know, the same argument holds for other levels, but I think the more local you go, the more it's worth interrogating what net zero means and requires.
Thank you. The slippery city is a lovely terminology. Thank you. Questions come through from the chat from your fellow author, Matthew Patterson, who's querying, I wonder if there is another dimension to the excess of net zero, which is about scales and actors. This is what has happened, is that net zero has migrated from, back to questions of scale, from a global logic, so getting global net emissions to zero, but then all sorts of actors, cities, corporations, the university, etc., have assumed it makes sense at their scales, and that's distracted people by reopening the option for offsetting. Good question. I.e., is the issue who has been empowered by the net to undermine their focus on zero?
Yes, and it's an excellent question, and I guess it picks up really well on what we were just talking about. So thanks for that, Matt. Yeah, I think it is about that downsampling from the global scale, because I think we can say, again, a lot more concretely about what needs to happen on the planetary scale. But I think much of the politics is who does what within that, and what share of the remaining emissions pie each different entity or territory should get. And I think that's, you know, that's definitely part of it. But then I think there's also, you know, some of the debates around offshoring of emissions. And again, who kind of assumes political culpability for that? I think that's, again, an interesting question. I don't think we talk enough about investment either. And then, of course, you raise the point about the net undermining their focus on zero. And I think, yeah, again, the more slippery the concept has become, and the more of an empty signifier that it's become, I think it's offered a lot more leeway for people being a bit overly generous with how far they stretch the budgets, using offsetting and nets to string out their emissions a little bit further than maybe they should.
Thanks, Joe. Great question there, Matt. Thank you. So another one's just come through on the chat from John, asking whether you, or indeed anybody else, has attempted to apply carbon accountability based upon financial investment and ownership. And if so, are there any standout points of the picture that picture provides compared to accountability being on the purchaser or the consumer?
Again, it's a really, really good question. I think most studies tend to focus on consumption, and therefore I think the other end of that spectrum, talking about downstream income enabled or investment based emissions, is really, really interesting. I've only ever been able to find one study that's actually done this. In many ways it mirrors, and again, if we're thinking about nations here, I think it mirrors what you'd see for consumption-based emissions. So for those, you know, heavy service sector-based economies, Europe, the US, you see those as being, much more culpable than you would do if you were looking at scope 1 and scope 2 emissions alone. But yeah, I definitely think this is one of those areas where there could be much further research, especially in a quantitative sense, right? Thinking as a qualitative researcher, we often construct arguments around divestment, but I think we've not often got the numbers to hang them on in a way, especially if we're talking about territories rather than, say, a business.
No, it's a really good, sorry, forgive me, I'm nodding. I deal with something very similar when the terms do matter in sustainability. We unapologetically throw all of these terms around, which then completely reframes our strategies and our targets. And in relation to that point, another question has come through from Adam, poignant one, asking, how does the politics and argument shift when zero carbon budgets for 1.5 degrees C start to get blown? So at the Green Summit, Greater Manchester Green Summit last month, it was stated that we have 2 years left for the budget for the city region at current rates of emissions.
Yeah, I think it's a solid point, and I too feel like we're reaching that kind of moment where we're going to have to sit back and go, is this even feasible at this point? And Adam, I know you're working at the Manchester level a lot, and yeah, I'm seeing the same. I do feel like within the next 2 years, we're going to have to question, whether we can have a science-based budget to make our fair share towards staying within 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. So yeah, it's increasingly difficult, because I do think there are these proper limits to us playing our part, and I think that's where starting to look at the other ways we can assume accountability for our emissions come into play. So if we can't hold our city budget, maybe we should start thinking about what we do around the city's role in aviation, or the city's role in investment, or the city's role in consumption. You've got to start looking at those other levers if we're failing at the main lever that we're pulling. So that's where I'd go to with that. It's not a particularly hopeful vision, I'm sorry about that, but yeah, I think it's a really, really good point.
Thanks, Joe. Do you mind me asking, just in relation to, you use the word responsibility a couple of times there, it's a question that our students often ask, what they can do and what their role is in net or zero carbon. What would you advise? What can people do?
It's a good question. One of my favorite graphics is an Oxfam study done a few years ago, which shows who is responsible for the vast majority of emissions from a consumption-based perspective. And it shows, around 50% of emissions from that understanding come from the top 10% of earners. But I think, that doesn't mean that, everyone else can't do anything. I think many people could draw attention to those high emitters, and I think that's absolutely where we should focus. I think the kinds of questions that I put towards the end of the presentation, I would love it if people were holding big organizations and cities and governments to account by asking those kind of questions that allow us to, be a bit sneaky with our carbon budgets. I think that is absolutely what I would encourage students in particular to do, because, students are experts on these things. They are learning about it every day. And yeah, I think holding people to account, I think, is absolutely the way that they should go right now.
Thanks, Joe. I couldn't agree more, but thank you. Are there any other questions? We do have a couple of minutes. People do have to go to their next appointments. We do appreciate. Please do feel free, and thank you for joining us. But we have another couple of minutes. If there are any further questions from the floor, please do feel free to pop them into the chat. I'll just give it a moment or two. People are heading off, which is very okay. It's busy days. Okay. Well, I think all that remains is to thank both of our presenters today for a truly thought-provoking late lunchtime. Some really interesting ideas. Thank you for joining us and for posing your questions. Just triple checking we have answered everything, and yes, I think we have. So thank you ever so much for joining us. There is a full set of discussions through Sustainable Futures, and hope to see many of you again in the future. Thanks particularly to Joe and to Jonatan, and for you for joining us. Thank you.